Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Maya Luria with TMC for Seniors, and I am so happy to have Mary Mellady here with us today. Mary is the TMC Director of Connected Health and Wellness, and she's going to be talking about making the smart carb choice. So, welcome, Mary.
Thank you, Maya. All
Um,
right.
we love having you here, and we're going to go ahead and jump into your presentation. I think there's a lot of great information in here that people are going to love. So I'll go ahead and get started.
All right. Okay, so making the smart carb choice. Unfortunately, carbs sometimes get a really bad rep because there are some less healthy carb choices out there. And so today I want to talk about how we can really make sure that we're using and choosing the carbs as best we can. All right. So, first, a little laugh for the morning. The potatoes in the clam chowder taste weird. That's because they're not potatoes, they're cauliflower, which is low in carbohydrate. Anything you can make with potatoes, you can make better with cauliflower. Great. Look at me. I'm making the garbage better with cauliflower. I really like this comic because I think that obviously I'm not a huge fan of cauliflower always, and in the place of everything. And I have a brother who's huge into cauliflower, so I think it's really funny that I've came across this comic. But so there are carbs in some vegetables, and some higher and some lower. And so in this case, she's trying to substitute a higher carbohydrate food with something that's lower in carbohydrate. But really, the gist of this is probably the cream in the soup is even worse than the potato in the soup. So let's get going here. So today we're going to go over the definition of what is a carbohydrate, what role does carbohydrates have in our diet, what are the different types of carbohydrates, what are some main carbohydrate foods, what are the recommendations, and how do we select a healthy versus an unhealthy carb? Because there's a little bit of both out there. All right. So first, a carbohydrate, it's in its most basic form is a sugar molecule, and so everybody's going to say, "Oh, it's sugar. It's bad. I don't want to eat it." But that is just at its molecular level. So all carbs aren't bad. We need that sugar because that gives us energy. It feeds our brain and helps our organs do what they need to do. It's one of the main three nutrients found in food. So these are called macronutrients. And the macronutrients are carbohydrates, protein, and fat. Those are the main building blocks of everything we eat. And the proportion of each of those building blocks shifts depending on the kind of food that we're eating. And within those building blocks, they kind of break down into different things. So carbohydrates, they break down into their most basic structure, which is a sugar molecule. Protein breaks down into its most basic structure, which is an amino acid, and fat breaks down into a fatty acid chain. And so all of those things help our body function, heal, grow, everything it needs to do to keep us alive and doing what we want to do. So if you get nothing else out of this presentation, please get that carbohydrates aren't bad, that we need them in our diet. There are three types of carbohydrates, primarily starches, fiber, and sugars. And carbohydrates are primarily found in plant foods. Okay, so when we talk about the main foods that they're in, you'll notice that most of them are plants. All right, the role of carbohydrates. It's an essential nutrient, the main source of energy for our brain, for our muscles, and for a lot of our other tissue. So without that carbs, we start to kind of lose some energy. It kicks off our whole process in our body of using all the other nutrients the way they need to be used. So to eliminate all carbohydrates from our diet is going to have a very negative effect on our body. Fiber, which, as we just said, is a part of the carbohydrate, is a type of carbohydrate rather, sorry, helps us with our digestion and promotes a healthy gut. And if you've heard any of my other talks, a healthy gut is very important for our overall health. It's linked to our brain, our memory. It's linked to chronic diseases. It's linked to chronic pain and our joint health. So having a healthy gut is becoming more and more evidence-based as what we need to be focusing on for our overall health. So the fiber that we find in a lot of carbohydrates is good for us. It also, the fiber helps to delay the absorptions of carbs and it helps with that sugar regulation. So if you have diabetes, you will often see something called net carbs, and that's where you get to subtract the fiber from the total carbohydrate because then that net carb, it's because that fiber slows the absorption of the carbohydrate into our blood. And so that's good for somebody with diabetes to help kind of have a little bit more balanced blood sugar. Glycogen. This is the glucose that's stored in our liver and stored in our muscles for future use. So on the previous slide, when I say carbohydrates' most basic form is a sugar molecule, glycogen is that stored form of that sugar molecule that our cells use in the event of we haven't eaten in a while. So then it goes to the liver and says, hey, liver, give me some energy. And that's where it gets it from. You hear athletes, ultra athletes, that they do this big carb loading the day before an event because they are packing those muscle cells full of glycogen. So then when they're out there doing their event, they have a lot of energy for those muscles to use to stay strong and fast. So the different types of carbs, and this is where we get into the making a smart carb choice versus making not the best carb choice. So the smart carb is the complex carb. These are the polysaccharides. And again, that's just a chemical descriptor of what a complex carb is. Poly meaning many. It's all of these different branches together. So it's a very complex molecule. They take longer for your body to process because they are complex. They are less likely to cause spikes in your blood sugar, and they help us feel full longer. And these are things like starches and fibers. So when I say starch, I'm thinking of things like whole wheat bread, corn tortillas, brown rice, or quinoa, something like that. And they contain a lot of vitamins, minerals, and fiber. And again, we talked about that fiber being great for helping us to feel full, regulating our blood sugar, and really good for our digestive tract. So complex carbohydrates, these are good for us. The simple carbohydrates, which are the mono and the disaccharides, again, just a chemical term that means it's just this single strand or two strands. So it's a very basic structure that's easy for our body to digest and pull into our bloodstream. And that causes our blood sugar to rise up pretty quickly and hence drop pretty quickly. So these are things like coming up in the holiday season. These are candies. This is what else are simpler carbohydrates would be things like juices or things like a syrup or, all of those really concentrated sources of sweet that we really seem to love a lot during the holidays. And so it's primarily sugar. And I want to break down sugar into two different categories. I want to talk about the naturally occurring sugar as well as those that are added sugars. Okay, and we'll go into that a little bit more later. But so that you understand that simple carbohydrates, very basic form of a glucose molecule or other kind of molecular structure that breaks down easily, causes our blood sugar to rise, generally associated with sugar and processed foods. The complex carbs on the other side are very big molecules that take a long time for our body to digest. They help keep our blood sugar a little more regulated and help us to feel full. Okay. And so here's another little comment, how you can tell the difference between a complex carb because he's there reading his book and outside doing yoga, or the simple carbs. That's the cupcake and the French fries sitting there. They're gonna watch The Bachelorette coming up on TV. So Sugar is sugar is sugar. So I noted that the simple carbs are primarily sugar. And there is a lot of discussion about, oh, this is a healthy form of sugar, or this is healthier for me. Regardless of the source or the name, sugar is always just sugar. And I'm not saying we can never have sugar, but be aware that it's still just sugar. So agave nectar is still just sugar. Cane sugar corn syrup or high fructose corn syrup, still just sugar. High fructose corn syrup gets a very bad name. We try to avoid that. Cane sugar is really no better. Dextrose, maltodextro, fructose, or sucrose. A lot of times food manufacturers will use fructose because if we've become savvy enough, we've learned, oh, fructose is the sugar that we find in fruit, so it's healthier for us. Not when they just pull it straight out and extract it from the fruit and leave all the healthy stuff behind. It's still just sugar. Honey, syrup, molasses, beet sugar, fruit juice, all just forms of sugar that food manufacturers are using to sweeten processed foods for us. Now, in many cases, you personally may tolerate one of these sugars better. And what I mean by tolerate is that you may have a less extreme rise in your blood sugar than somebody else. So I hear from a lot of people that agave nectar, they don't have quite as high of a rise in their blood sugar when they use agave nectar. And that's very individualistic. What I like to say is the best choice on this list here is that whichever one you can use the least amount of to satisfy whatever it is you're using the sugar for is the best one to choose. So what I mean by that is that if you are going to sweeten tea and you can use just a drop of honey, but you're going to need 3 tablespoons of cane sugar, then the honey is going to be better for you. But if you're going to sprinkle something over the top and that you just need a half a teaspoon, but you're going to put 3 tablespoons of agave nectar in there, then in that case, the cane sugar is a better choice. It's whichever you can use the least amount of. I hope that makes sense. I did include a website. This Sugar Science has a lot more information about all the different names that sugar goes by. So I would encourage you to take a look at that because a lot of food manufacturers are becoming very smart, very savvy in the way that they make up their products to hide sugar from us. Even when we're really trying our best to read the labels, sometimes we don't know what something is called. Another thing to look at is as consumers, we are becoming very smart about reading labels. And most of us know that ingredients are listed in the amount of how much is in the product. In other words, the first ingredient is what is the majority of the ingredient in the product. The second, there's a little less of, third, a little less so. Rather than just using one source of sugar in some products, they are now using 6 or 7 different types of sugars. And don't think it's because they want to have this more robust flavor. They just want to hide all the sugar from us. I will give you a perfect example. And I'm going to use an example of a food that I happen to really enjoy. And I don't think it is without any value, which is a fig Newton. There is a good use for fig Newton if you're out hiking. It's got some good energy source for it, and it's fairly low in fat. But fig Newtons used to use cane sugar, and it was the 3rd or 4th ingredient, probably the 3rd ingredient. So you'd say, there's a lot of sugar in this fig Newton. Now they use at least 6 different types of sugar in that fig Newton so that it goes farther down the list. Meaning, so now it's whole wheat and figs, and then it might be something else, and then sugars, there's a little bit of sugar, and then another ingredient, and then some other type of sugar, and then some coloring, and another type of sugar, and then an additive. So they've spread it, they've used a lot of different sugars so that it's a smaller amount. My point is, when you are looking at labels, don't just rely on where a sugar ingredient is placed in that list. Also look at how many different types of sugars you might see in that list, because the 7 or 8 different types of sugars in this fig Newton equates to the same amount of sugar that was in there when it was just cane sugar listed as number 3. So don't let them fool you. The other thing that they're using a lot of is fruit juice, because we automatically think fruit, healthy, this is good for me. But when all they're doing, again, like the fructose, is extracting the juice out of the fruit and using it to color and sweeten that food, it's just the same as sugar, because now they've left behind all the fiber, they've left behind a good amount of the vitamins or minerals that might have been present in that fruit as a whole fruit. So just be aware. All right, I could stay on sugar all day long, but I'm going to move on. Okay, carbohydrate-rich foods. So this one is vegetables, which I'm talking about primarily the starchy ones, like the potatoes, the sweet potatoes, the squashes, the summer squashes, things like that. Beans, whether or not you put that in the protein group or you put that in the vegetable group, there's carbs in beans. Fruits. Fruits are predominantly carbohydrates, and that is not to say that it is not good. It just is, they are very rich in carbohydrates, so they give us a lot of energy, a lot of quick energy. Okay, so remember that. Grains. When we're talking about grains, this is both processed grains as well as whole grains. And that's what I want you to start thinking about when we're thinking about healthy and good choices of carbohydrates versus those that aren't as smart for us. If you're thinking about rice, think about a brown rice or a black rice that's a whole grain that hasn't been modified, that hasn't been processed, versus the white rice that has been. Thinking about whole wheat breads, not just a tan colored bread, but those that use whole wheat flour as their number one ingredient versus a white bread. That whole wheat flour has more fiber, has more nutrients to it than that white bread does. And so it is going to be better used by our body. It has more nutrient density to it. Dairy is a carbohydrate-rich food. It is also a good source of protein. So a lot of these, as you've noticed, I'm telling you, have other benefits with them. So the grains have the fibers. This dairy has protein. It has calcium. So dairy is a healthy source of carbohydrates. There is a lot of debate out there right now, and I don't know how it got started, about whole fat dairy versus non-fat or low-fat dairy. It is still our position that non-fat or the 1% dairy products are healthier for you, for your heart specifically, than whole fat dairy is. There is a lot of saturated fat associated with whole fat dairy products, whether it's milk, whether it's cottage cheese, whether it's a Greek yogurt, and that saturated fat is what is linked to increased heart disease, risk for heart disease and stroke. But it is a good source of protein. So look for the non-fat or the 1% dairy products. And then beans. I have a separate group for beans, but sometimes you want to associate them as vegetables. But beans are also very rich in carbohydrates as well as protein and fiber. So again, healthy choices. When I'm referring to beans, I am usually, what we say is beans, dried beans are going to be your best that you're going to cook yourself. However, that's a lot of work. So we realize that canned beans are somewhat of a necessity. And so we just ask that you rinse those really well and drain them before you eat them. And then they rinses off some of that extra sodium. And also stay away from like the baked beans that are loaded with extra sugar, simple sugars, in addition to the complex carbs that are just naturally in the beans. So I wanted to go back to talking about sugar a little bit and reading the label. And so I have two pictures up here of Greek yogurt. The first Greek yogurt is a non-fat plain Greek yogurt, and the one on the right side is a strawberry Greek yogurt, also non-fat. And I picked both that were non-fat, and I picked the exact same brand for the reason that I want to show the difference between naturally occurring sugar and added sugar, so that you don't, if you start to look at labels, you don't get confused about what's this mean. So when you look at a label, they always group it as total carbohydrates, and under that includes fiber, it includes total sugars, and now there's a little subcategory that says added sugars, because in something like dairy, there is naturally occurring sugars because there's carbohydrate in there. So when you see naturally occurring sugars, that's just the milk. That's the milk sugars that are in there, and that's healthy for us. But when you look at the strawberry one, you can see that now that there's added sugars as well, and that's to give that strawberry flavoring. So if you'll notice, in the plain version, there's 6 grams of total carbohydrate. So in dairy, there's no fiber. And there's 6 grams of total sugar, 0 of which are added. So that's all just milk sugars. When you look at the strawberry one, now you see that there's 18 grams of total carbohydrate. There's a little bit of fiber, very, very small, because they do add a little bit of strawberry puree in there. And 17 grams of total sugar versus on the plain one, 6 grams of sugar. And the difference is that 11 grams of added sugar that they've added in the form of, if you then pop over and look at the ingredients, cane sugar, there's some sugars in that strawberry, and there's sugars in that fruit and vegetable juices. And they say it's for color, but it's also to add some sweetness in there as well. So when you're looking at a product, just be aware of what is naturally occurring versus what the manufacturers have added, because that plays into making a smart carbohydrate choice. In this situation, if everything else is equal, meaning time and price and access to fruits and things like that, your healthier choice here is going to be to choose the plain yogurt and then chop up your own strawberries on top. And if you need a little sweetness, then you add that in yourself, very little bit at a time, to get to the point that you are enjoying what you're eating, but without adding quite as much sugar as it has already come in a pre-prepared form. Okay. On to the recommendations. In general, and I'm going to say this very broadly, because every individual has very specific nutrient needs, so we can never say this is what everybody needs. If you want to know specifically what your nutrient requirements would be for you individually, you should meet with a dietitian, okay? Because they can look at your age, your gender, your level of activity, all of your medical history, to then build the best diet for you. But in general, people should get about 45 to 65% of their calories from carbohydrates. So think about that for a minute. That's over half of your daily calories comes from carbs. Okay? And if you're thinking about your plate, so now down a little bit, one row there, half your plate is made up of vegetables and fruits. Now remember back to a few slides that fruits are almost entirely carbohydrates, and many of the vegetables we choose are higher in carbohydrates, but even the ones that are lower in carbohydrates still have some carbs to them. Even if it's only 5 grams, there's still some carbohydrates in them. So that makes up about half of your plate of every meal, of every snack. So always think that color. I want a lot of color on my plate. That's what your fruits and vegetables are giving to you. Grains. Grains make up about a quarter of your plate, and they're whole grains. They're the brown rice, whole grain pastas, whole wheat breads, corn tortillas, whole grain cereals. So think that whole grain. And dairy, um, making it low fat or fat free, the recommendation is 3 servings a day, whether that's as milk, yogurt, cottage cheese. We don't recommend cheese a lot because cheese is very high in saturated fat. So if you're going to eat cheese, which I love cheese, so I'm not going to tell anybody you should never have cheese, but eat it, enjoy it, savor the flavor. Don't just put cheese in a burrito. You're never going to taste it. Don't just put a slice on a sandwich. You're never going to notice it's there. If you do a sandwich well, you're going to notice all the other textures from the vegetables and whatever protein source you're using, and a really good whole grain bread. So make sure that cheese, you're enjoying it versus just adding it. So that's the recommendation of how to use those different carbohydrate sources on your plate and in what kind of proportion. Sugar. So women, we recommend that you get no more than 25 grams of added sugar. So this is where reading those labels can come into play, that you start to understand where's all my added sugar coming from? Is it coming from the yogurt that I thought was healthy because I'm making, a fruit parfait or something? Or is it coming from, am I drinking soda? There's a lot of added sugar. It's 100% added sugar. Am I drinking coffee and adding sweetener to my coffee? Just know where your added sugar is coming from and how much of it you're eating daily. So the 25 grams equates to about 6 teaspoons. That is not very much at all. So I need to make note of this. Personally, I have a sugar problem. A lot of us have a sugar problem. So ask your friends, what else do you do? What do you try? And maybe get some good suggestions from them too, because sugar is one of those things that's present all around us. And it's often hard to see in different products because, again, food manufacturers are very smart. They hide them from us. And it's very tempting. Men, you have the advantage here. You get 36 grams of added sugar per day, which equates to 9 teaspoons. That's still not very much, but you do get a little bit more. Fiber, as we talked at the beginning, fiber is very good for us. It helps with our healthy GI system. It helps with the regulation of our blood sugar. It helps us feel fuller. So fiber we need to have in our diet. And as Americans, we generally don't get enough fiber each day. For women, we are searching to try to get 25 grams per day, 21 to 25, ideally 25. Men, you want 30 to 38 grams per day. And men get a little more sugar. They get a little bit more, have to have a little bit more fiber. In general, men require more calories too. Again, in general, just because they're generally larger in stature. They're usually taller than women are. And they generally have a little bit more muscle mass than women, just by genetics of how they are made. So more fiber for men, and up to that 38 grams would be ideal. All right, so high carb, low carb, no carb. This is, you hear everybody talking about, I'm on a low carb, no carb diet, or you hear athletes saying, I'm on eating a high carb diet because I need lots of energy. They have their place with the exception of no carbs. High carb diets, they're energy rich, and these are generally beneficial to athletes, because especially endurance athletes, because like I said, our muscles use that carbohydrate for its energy source to fire those muscles. It's like the gasoline in a car. That's what fires our muscles are these carbohydrates. So generally, they need to be on a higher carbohydrate diet, more towards that 65% of their calorie consumption. Low carbs, which means a little bit higher ratio of protein. We are finding, and there's not a lot of good research out there, but there is so much anecdotal and subjective information that we're collecting that for premenopausal and perimenopausal women, that eating a little bit less carbohydrate with a little bit higher ratio of protein is beneficial, because there's a lot of changes in our hormones and fat placement, that this higher ratio of protein to carbs is a little bit better for us and helps with that weight management as our hormones kind of shift all over. I would say that no carbs is never a good idea. It is never a good idea to eliminate an entire food group or macronutrient from your diet. Even if you're diabetic, you don't want to be on no carbs. You want to be on a balanced carb diet. And again, a dietitian can help you with that. So the best choice, in lieu of meeting with a dietitian and having them tell you exactly how many grams of carbs and what your macronutrients and what your protein should be, is moderation, a balance of healthy carbohydrates, protein, and healthy fat. I will say that most research studies tell us that Americans eat plenty of protein. The average American, for the activities that we do, eat plenty of protein. We eat probably plenty of carbs, and we probably eat plenty of fats too. We are not malnourished in general, but eating healthy carbs and making that smart carb choice is where it is up to us. So I want to talk about the potato. This is Percy the potato. And I named him Percy because I learned an interesting fact making this presentation, is that the potato came from Peru. I did not know that. At least that's what it says on the web. So if I'm wrong, please somebody let me know that. And Percy is an original Peruvian name. So originally, when the potato came about, he was a plain potato. He is low in fat. He's got a little protein in there, and he's packed with fiber, especially if you eat the skin, vitamins, and minerals. And he was great for us. He filled us up, he was warm, and he was healthy for us. And then we decided, well, heck, if he's good that way, let's make him even better by dicing him and frying him, or adding salt and vinegar to him, or even better, let's put some cheese, some bacon, some sour cream, and we'll add some chives so that we can say we're putting some vegetables on our vegetable. And now he's even better, right? Now we've just made him high in fat, sodium, loss of his fiber content, because most of the time we take the skin off, or if we're eating a baked potato, we don't even eat the skin because it's all the stuff inside that's better. And so we lose a lot of the nutritional value of Percy the potato. So the potato in and of itself is not an unhealthy carb choice. It's what we've done to it, or how we choose to eat them, that does make it an unhealthy carb choice. And this is not to say that sweet potatoes are all the rage. They're so much healthier than the white potato. And they do have a higher percentage of fiber. They are higher in vitamin C and some other nutrients. But they're just as bad for us if we douse them in butter and put brown sugar and bake them with marshmallows on top. That's no better for us. Nor is it when we dice them up and fry them and we have sweet potato fries. Or there is something called sweet potato tater tots that are now packed with brown sugar and diced up and fried in this little ball. And people think, oh, it's sweet potatoes, that must mean it's so much healthier. No, it's no healthier for you than the regular French fry now. So we, as consumers, have ruined the potato. If we take it back to its original use, where we eat just a baked potato and we eat the skin, and maybe we put very little bit of butter on there, little bit of butter, and we were to use non-fat Greek yogurt on top of it, or cottage cheese and salsa, we are now getting extra protein, no extra fat, or this added salt with no nutritional value. and now the potato becomes healthy again. So it's all about how we choose to eat our carbs as well as to the type of carb we're choosing. So the smart potato choice here is to roast them or bake them or even to air fry them. And the bottom one is choosing healthy toppings, but I think that kind of got cut off. So think about that, this little story of Percy when we're looking at different carbohydrates. It's how are we eating this? What are we doing to it? You know, brown rice is wonderful for us. It's high in fiber, high in niacin. But if we fry it with eggs and fried vegetables, and then we pour soy sauce over the top of it, now we're just eating a lot of salt. So think about what you're doing to your carbohydrates in addition to what kinds of carbs you're choosing. So smart carb choices, do's, eat whole foods or real foods, foods that your grandparents would recognize. So things like that are processed and baked, like a Taki, a taquito, a Tostito or Dorito. Our grandparents aren't going to recognize what those products are because they didn't have them. They'd recognize a corn tortilla, though. Eat the whole, real food, unprocessed, as often as possible. Choosing fresh or frozen vegetables, and in some cases, canned if you don't have access to fresh or frozen vegetables all the time, or in the case of tomatoes or beans, then canned vegetables are also an acceptable choice. Choosing fresh, frozen, or dried fruits. I didn't put juice on here because we really try to recommend folks don't drink a lot of juice because it's so concentrated a source of sugar. We drink juice very quickly, and it's a high source of calories as well without much of the fiber, and a lot of times the nutrients are lost in the juicing process. So choosing your fruits in the form of fresh fruits, frozen fruits, or dried fruits. The other thing is to remember about dried fruits is they are dried. They are a concentrated source, so you can't eat the same amount of fresh or frozen as compared to a dry for the calorie content. So a serving of fresh or frozen fruit is generally half of a cup. That's a very general recommendation. And the serving size of a dried fruit is only a quarter cup because it's lost all of its water content. And so that's why it's such a smaller portion. Also under do's, whole grains and starches. So I keep saying this, the whole grain, whole wheat breads. Some people suggested Dave's Killer Bread. It's great. It's packed with seeds as well as lots of grains. Thinking about trying some different types of grains. You know, have you ever tried farro? Have you ever tried quinoa? Most everybody's tried quinoa. Have you tried black rice? Have you tried adding extra barley to your soups that you make or cooking it up and adding it on top of your salad? It's got a lovely nutty flavor. So really trying to think what other kinds of grains can I try that are whole grains. In some cases, they're referred to as an ancient grain, and all ancient grain means is that a food producer hasn't modified it or produced it in some other form. So rice is not considered an ancient grain because now we have white rice, which is a processed grain. So think about what can I try that might be a little bit different and give me a little bit more variety in my diet. And then low fat or fat-free dairy. We've talked about that. The don'ts are processed foods, candies, whether that's a processed dessert, whether that's a processed bread or processed cereal. Try to avoid those. Fried vegetables or veggies topped with cheese or cream sauce. I had some kids tell me their favorite food ever was Brussels sprouts, and I thought, whoa, that's really weird. And it's because their mom covered it in cheese. So of course that's going to be good. Juice, I already mentioned. Processed or white grains, talked about that. Whole fat dairy or sweetened dairy. And I didn't mention the sweetened dairy. There's a lot of yogurts out there because yogurt's healthy for us, right? It's a good source of calcium and protein. And here's what I'll tell you. If it looks like dessert, it is dessert. I actually literally just saw a tiramisu yogurt. Tiramisu is a dessert. It is not a healthy choice of dairy. So think about that. If it looks like dessert, kind of tastes like dessert, it probably is dessert. So it's not going to be on your smart carb choice. Sodas and other sweetened beverages, try to limit or avoid as much as possible. Stick with water. If you have a hard time drinking water, then maybe try adding some fruits or vegetables into your water. There's lots of great bottles out there that you can drop your cucumber or your melon or your lemon right into the center tube and have your water around it. Or maybe even try adding, if you want that fizz, you can do just club soda or just off the soda stream kind of thing, and adding some fruits or vegetables to that. So then you get fizz, but you're not having any extra sugar added. The LaCroix and the Pellegrinos are a good example of different flavored kind of no sugar added carbonated beverages. And then watch the snack foods. Oftentimes, carbohydrates get a bad rap is because they're the things that we eat when we need some comfort. We will, when we're having a bad day or we're really stressed or we're really tired, we will tend to grab some of these not so smart carbs. We will go for the mac and cheese. We will stop at the drive-thru and get the French fries. We might grab a donut, as in this picture. We might sit in front of TV and snack on chips or snack on cookies. Very rarely, I used to say never, but very rarely do you see somebody sitting in front of television snacking on just cubes of meat. I say rarely because I did catch my son just eating a tray of pulled chicken one night, and I thought that was the weirdest thing I've ever seen. But more often than not, we will choose a processed carb to snack on, not mindfully at all. And so we will just eat right out of the container mindlessly, and we get a lot of calories that way because they're high in sugar, high in calories, high in fat generally. Snack foods, try to avoid them. Never, ever, ever eat them directly from the package. So if you are going to have something like a cookie or a chip, pre-portion it out. Don't, again, eat it from the package. All right? All right, so that's your don'ts. And that kind of concludes my presentation. So I hope that I answered all of my objectives. And if you have questions, please let me know.
So, Mary, I have one question, or maybe a couple, but one of the questions I saw you had dried fruit on the list for a do. Are there certain dried fruits? Because I know some dried fruits have a lot of sugar, right? So
right. Okay. Well, thank you for that question, Maya. So dried fruits in and of themselves are kind of higher in sugar because they've gone from a whole fruit, all the water's been taken out, so now they're concentrated sorts of fruit and hence fruit sugar. But there's some, like you said, that have added sugars to them. The first thing I'm thinking of are the mangoes from Costco that are covered in sugar.
oh, they are delicious.
They are so good. Okay, that would not be considered a healthy fruit carb choice. That's considered dessert. So make that dessert. But there, like there's the craisins that are flavored. There's different flavored craisins. They are flavored with added sugar because craisins are pretty sour. They're pretty tart. So yes, there are fruits that have added sugars to them. So what you have to do is just read the label. And if it's a good dried fruit, it should just have dried fruit and maybe some sort of preservative, but it shouldn't have a sugar format added to it.
Okay. Now, so one more question about, let's say, pasta or rice. And I know whole grains are best. But what if you just don't really love the taste of maybe, brown rice and love white rice, or you love pasta, but maybe not the whole grain pasta, maybe the texture. Is there anything that you can do? Are those still okay? Not okay? Should they completely avoid those?
So I'm not one to say you have to completely avoid anything. what I would suggest in terms of rice, if you don't like brown rice, but you can tolerate it, you don't have any reason why you wouldn't eat it. Maybe try mixing white and brown together. So at least you get a little bit of the whole grain. Or maybe try mixing quinoa with your white rice. So you get a little bit of whole grain with your processed grain. In terms of pasta, maybe you try one of the protein sourced pastas and see if you like that. So it's not a grain pasta. It's like it's a red bean or it's a chickpea kind of pasta. Um, and maybe you like that. And so now you're not even getting any of the grain, but you're getting protein.
Okay,
So
great.
try some different things. Or again, if you don't like any of those, at least try to mix some of that whole wheat pasta with the white pasta, just so you get a little bit.
Great. Okay. This was wonderful. I love to hear about. I love my carbs, so I am a complete carbaholic, so I can tell. Yeah, so it's great to hear that it is okay to have your potato,
Yeah. Yeah.
and it's all about what you do to it. From a lot of it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, cereal used to be a main, a staple for households, and now they've become, their dessert. They really, I mean, there's a Frosties, like as in the frosty drink, cereal with marshmallows in it because the chocolate cereal wasn't enough. They had to add chocolate marshmallows. So yeah, they've kind of, but then if you look at something like a Cheerio or a grape nut or a cornflake, that's still a whole grain cereal. So it isn't what we've kind of done to them.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much for being here. I look forward to having you again, Mary, about whatever our next topic is. But this was wonderful. We'll go ahead and get this shared out as well to everyone. So thanks for being here today.
Thanks for having me, Maya.